Hi everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook. Today's story, Spool Donkeys. Hello there. We've talked at times about some of the fraternities of men who by their particular skill build a tradition in Grays Harbor country that lives on to this day. Such men were the keen-eyed otter hunters whose sharp shooting was the sharpest of any group of men of their time. Such men were the drivers of the bull teams that hauled the big logs from our early wood operations. Such men were the shipbuilders who fashioned the sleek lines of sailing ships that once slipped down the ways of Grays Harbor shipyards. And such men were the spool tenders of the first donkey engines that snorted and puffed in the woods of the harbor. Theirs was a rugged fraternity of strong-armed men who learned their job well, and if they didn't, they paid the price in barked shins and broken bones. Hugh McKinley, Dave Murphy, Tom Keeley, Buster Crawford, Rube Crowley. Do you recall these names? They date from the early era of Grays Harbor logging, and a short era too, for logging was on the change in those days, and the reign of the Dole Bear, history-making though it was, and a great milestone in logging, was short. It was more than half a century ago that the Dole Bear donkey came tooting into the woods of Grays Harbor to start the bull whackers looking for new jobs and send the old-timers deep into the timber scratching their heads and wondering if the darn thing was practical. Doleberries, the old-timers called them, and they turned the bull teams into pot roast and hamburgers. And the better it was, the later, for those beasts of the woods had pulled a powerful lot of the toughness into their hams, and there was no choice cut for the one-time timber beast. They had a pint-sized boiler, and upright spool, an assortment of shafts and gears, and sizable flywheels, and a terrific appetite for windfalls. For the Dole Bear itself, as we mentioned the other night, it was a dream come true for the senior partner of the San Francisco shipping firm of Dole Bear and Carson. He had watched the bull team slowly snaking the big stuff out of the Washington forest. He had also watched the captains turn on many of the ship operated by his lines. Put that captain on skids, he reasoned, power it with a steam engine. It would outpull any team of bulls that have ever snorted in the tall timber. And it did. Grays Harbor logging was off to a roaring start with bull teams doing the work when the first Dole Bear appeared. It was brought north by Cy Blackwell, one of the harbor's real pioneers in the marketing of the big wooden stuff. Cy bought the engine through the old Northwestern Company and had it hauled to the site he was logging near Grays Harbor City, and there it became the biggest drawing card in the world. Logging men came from all over the Northwest to get a look at the engine that did the work of a dozen bull teams and didn't need a four pile of hay to operate. The Dole Bear was used primarily for yarding to skid roads where turns were made up for the bulls and later horses. So to begin with, it didn't create an unemployment problem for the faithful, plodding animals that had enjoyed domination in the woods. The logs came out one at a time under the tug of the Dole Bear, with the butt cut normally limited to only 24 feet to get the largest scale possible out of the tree. The scaler always took the diameter at the top of the log, and the larger it was, the bigger the scale. But no matter how large, the Dole Bear proved to be the answer. Manning the little engine was a fireman. the engineer, and a spool tender. And on many a Dolber donkey, the engineer and fireman were the same man, with the woodcutter acting as stableman for the iron bull. The spool tender, as his name implies, minded the spinning spool that stood upright and spun a nod to the engineer. As well-equipped spool tender was armed with a riveted mitten to protect his hands from barbs and wire slivers, or whiskers, as the men called them. He stood by the spool and wound the line as it paid off the twisting capstan. Then common practice was about 6 turns of a spool with about 100 feet of line. It was a 7/8 wire. When it was not paid out, it was coiled neatly behind the spool tender. When the line came in from the man-sized spruced fir, it walked along at half-spun pace. When it hit a snag or a root, the Dolberg chugged and stopped, and the spool tender swore, spat on his hands, and took the slack away. Then the donkey puncher cooperating, the old Dolberry was given all it could to take the roaring and rattling of the spool tender, took up its turns and jerked them right out of the dirt. Something had to give, and at times it was the old Dolber that did the giving. The ban of the spool tender was a new line, stiff and mean, or show with it too many lead blocks. Both got kinks, which made it uncanny, flat, faulty, floppy, up and down wacky sound to the spool tender in what was usually his always sore shin, and the same spot every time got hit by the loose threads. It is estimated that a spool tender of the generation contributed not less than 50 new forms of profanity to the woodland vernacular just on kinks in the spools alone. And then there were the line horses who got wise with their years. They were the faithful old nags who hauled the line back into the woods for another hitch. They worked single-handedly and often knew more about their job than their handlers, who were called line horsemen. These horses had logging sense acquired over the years of doing the job and seemed to know as well as men which log should come out next. They would make a bee-line for the next log and stand patiently while the cable was unhooked, and often make their way back on their own to the Dolber for another pickup. They burned hay and spud peelings from the cook shack, and before the days of the hauling back rig of the high spool donkey, they were important to the logging as a piece of equipment in the woods. And now, except for the memories of the old-timers and in a few isolated spots in the Northwest, the Dolber is not only gone from us, but gone from sight. One of the last in operation, but I fear now retired forever, was the second Dolber ever brought into the county, and which was hidden away among the stumps and weeds of Arthur Biggs' place on the Wishkah for about 15 years. At the age of 40, it could still do an honest day's work. It was brought into the country by the Wishkah Boom Company and used near the company's dam upriver. Many old-timers will recall how the loggers would walk for 8 or 10 miles to get a look at the Dolberry in operation. Some to scoff and say it would never replace the ox. Others to predict that it was the coming thing in logging. Then, after years of service, it was acquired by Briggs, who used it for clearing his land. And there's one Grace Harbor resident who recalls clearly the performance of the old donkey. It was Joe Malinskowski, master mechanic for the city of Aberdeen, who probably knew as much about the old machine as any man who ever lived. For Joe once ran it for a boom company and still recalls how the flywheel got on dead center and the whole show would come to a stop. The spool tender would be cussed soundly, and the engineer would unscrew and release the valve on the steam chest, and the kickers off-center with his foot, which he stuck into the spokes of the flywheel and deftly got out in time to prevent being thrown over into the boiler. Then the whole thing would run fine until the spool tender forgot to slack off again in time, and the performance would be repeated. As Joe recalls, the little donkey, it was first fitted with the manila lines and would stretch and shrink with humidity. Overnight, the rope would shrink at times until the loggers would have to take the hitch over a stump or take it up a stretch to stretch it back into shape again. In a straight-away haul, the manila line would stretch 30 to 40 feet, taking as taut as a fiddle string. Then the log would start with a leap and a jump of 25 to 30 feet. There was no loafing in the skid road when the old doleberry was snagging in them, not at least in the days of the manila line. Joe also recalled the pull of the old doleber, which amazed the old-timers and would still confound the modern-day folks who think they have seen everything. More than once, the little engine would spat down and pull a walk right through a 3/4-inch steel line on a straight tug. In the case of that particular doleber, it was snorting away with the same boiler and same tubes some 40 years after it first saw the Grays Harbor country, and when a half a dozen of its stoutest spool tenders had been laid away. And to this day, the coming of modern logging to the big wood countries from the date of the first dolebers, and it was the same time chafing little engines that some said would never work that proved the know-how to develop into the side spools, the double drums, and finally the big electronic and diesels of today that can fly logs bigger than a doleber could ever move. But the change over in every case was accomplished by much doubting and not without reason. For the doleber replaced the bull team. Loggers tried to use them the same rigs they had found successful in their oxen. Of course, it wasn't even enough, and when they switched to heavier donkeys, they chugged the rigging and had proven successful with the doleberg, and again it wouldn't stand the strain. And with the little failures that came at first tries, came the head shaking and the doubters who vowed the old ways were best. But with each time, the men who made the rules as they went along found ways to make it work, and logging, as she was done in Grays Harbor, set the pace for the whole Northwest. And it was not surprising, for the men who pioneered the logging in the harbor country were tried and proven woodsmen who had won their tin pants in the logging game from Maine to Michigan. There was the famed crew who worked the first show near Grays Harbor City. All Coates, Mike Coates, Lee Coates, George Monroe, Simon Monroe, Bill LaVoice, Penny the Blacksmith, John Shaw, Bill Cameron, and Cy Blackwell. They were high tailors from Muskegon, most of them. They had driven logs through the white waters and skidded them over the crust of winter snow. They had grown up with the smell of fresh-cut ships in their nostrils and the hush of great timber spaces about them. And some of them, like Sam Monroe and Cy Blackwell, were to grow into legends amongst the woodsmen with whom they worked. Yes, the doleber was a milestone in harbor logging, and it produced a race of men, tradesmen, in an exclusive fraternity. The line loopers of the skinned shanks, the coil makers of the slivered hands, and the spool tenders of the old dolebers that brought steam into the woods and turned the bull teams into beefsteaks. And then, too, we dedicate the pages of this hometown scrapbook. Thank you for listening.